All right, everybody, trying a new camera setup, new software, new everything, and hopefully that's going to put a stop to my sync problem between video and audio, and the quality can go up a little bit. I'm going to replace this one because this is the worst. The other two that I have that were recorded with the previous equipment, I think those the problems are less severe and they don't last for the whole lecture. But this first one, the whole lecture was messed up. So I'll re-record this one. And then moving forward, it'll always be like this. And hopefully this will be the last time I have to redo lectures. And then I can spend more time doing what I really like to do, which is teach. And we can go from there. All right. So I wanted to go over chapter 6, equipment breakdown insurance. So in the industry, a lot of times they'll call this boiler and machinery coverage. And that tells a little bit about where this line developed. See, the idea was that I think one of the problems you have with equipment breakdown insurance is it leads you to believe that this covers damage to your equipment that breaks down. And it does, but that's not the worst part of these kinds of losses. The worst thing that can happen with these types of losses is this last piece on the slide here that says, look, when you have a steam boiler explosion, not only is the boiler damaged, but that can do damage to your property. And then back to the third point here, that property is probably not covered because damage to equipment is not a covered peril. That's going to be something that's excluded. It's not going to be on your basic cause of loss form, and it's not going to be on the broad cause of loss form. And you'd say, oh, well, if you got a special form, it's covered because everything's covered unless it's excluded. Mechanical breakdown is an exclusion. So if you did have a steam boiler explode, all the damage that would do, none of that's covered under your BPP because it's specifically excluded. So if you need that kind of coverage, equipment breakdown is something to think about in addition to the damage that's done to the actual equipment that has broken down. Wanted to talk about that. So that's really the key point. It's not so much the equipment that breaks, it's because it can cause catastrophic loss on top of that. And so all of a sudden, because these losses can be so serious, you start to see that loss control is really important. Sure, insurance is important, but insurance companies say, wait a minute, one of the ways we can cut our losses here is if we regularly expect this kind of equipment that is operating under pressure or it's operating under mechanical power or electrical power. All of these big, important, critical systems that could cause property damage to the rest of the building. This is stuff we've got to regularly inspect. So yeah, a steam boiler in a big building, that is not an uncommon way to heat. And so all of a sudden you have this major loss exposure that, yeah, you're not thinking about because everything's supposed to work correctly. And when it does, it's not a big deal. It's when it doesn't, that's a problem. So the people who designed these forms were the companies that were heavily involved in this kind of coverage. And this kind of coverage became necessary because it's an exclusion in the regular business personal property form. Mechanical breakdown is an exclusion. And so you had very technical knowledge from people who had very specific experience who ended up creating these forms. And even today, a lot, Daisy, sorry about that. We're still working on the concept of Daddy is working and trying to record a lecture, so we have to be quiet in the background. I don't know how old you have to be before that really sinks in, but apparently it's older than 10. So sorry about that. Anyway, you had specific people who really had technical knowledge, and they were the ones who ended up designing the coverage here. Let me go ahead and put this in a more formal light here. Oops, can I stretch this? Will they let me? Yeah, okay, that's good. Let me get the toolbar out of the way here. All right. So that's why this insurance line is necessary to begin with. It's because it's an exclusion in the special form, and it's not listed on the basic and the broad form. And those are named perils coverages, so those aren't covered in the first place. All right. So when we talk about insuring agreements, what we have here is we've got 10 of them again. That we have to talk about in terms of the insuring agreements, what these are going to look like. So first, we got to talk about the definitions that show up here. The first one is for it to be a covered cause of loss, the loss has to be due to breakdown of covered equipment. And that means a direct physical loss to equipment from mechanical or electrical failure. And the equipment that's covered is the equipment that's built to operate under pressure or under a vacuum system, or equipment that is utilizing electrical or mechanical energy. And that's what's happening here. And if you're looking in the books, you can see some of the what can end up happening here when you have one of these losses. Just the room that they've got a picture of a boiler explosion. The room is just completely destroyed. And that's their point, is that, yep, you got to fix the boiler, but you got all this other damaged equipment too that we have to deal with. And that's not an easy thing to handle. So we've got 10 insuring agreements here again. And we'll go through them one at a time. I'll just put them all up on the one slide so you have them, so you can see them. Make sure that this is lined up a little bit better. There we go. All right. So, property damage, that's the first one that we're thinking of, and that's the most obvious of these lines here. We're going to be paying direct damage to covered property. I'm just going to put this back on this slide. It seems to be working better when I do it this way. Okay, so we're going to pay for direct damage to covered property. And again, the big thing here is it's not just damaged equipment. Equipment is a subset of property. Property is a much bigger category. Property is everything else that's in the room, everything else that's in the building. If you have a steam boiler explosion, that thing's going to take off like a missile. It's going to destroy the room and probably the building. And like normally we'd say, all right, business personal property, that's the policy where we're looking for coverage, but mechanical breakdown is excluded as a cause of loss. So that's a problem. Another category of property that we're going to handle is other people's property that's in our care, custody, and control. We call this the bailee provision. And it's interesting. That sounds like if I damage somebody else's property that's in my control, that sounds like a liability loss. Later on, when we talk about the CGL, the Commercial General Liability Policy, we're going to find out that's excluded there. So this is a place where you can get coverage for damage to other people's property, at least from a mechanical breakdown. That's a very specific cause of loss. But that is one place where we can get some coverage here. Second insuring agreement, expediting expenses. So reasonable extra costs to speed up repairs. So just like in the business income policy, the extra expense coverage that we ran across there, it looks like there ought to be overlap here. But again, business income depends on your underlying cause of loss form. Mechanical breakdown is going to be excluded. So all of a sudden here, this is going to be, these extra expense coverages and business income coverages are going to be important. Here specifically, we're just talking about the specific business income extra expense of expediting expenses. So you got a rush job, you have to pay overtime to get it done because now you're down to half the functioning equipment. So you might have to pay overtime wages to get it done. And this is a place that you can do that with mechanical breakdown coverage, with boiler machinery coverage. Third insuring agreement, business income and extra expense. It works just like regular business income and extra expense insurance. It's just that that previous policy isn't going to kick in because, again, the cause of loss is mechanical breakdown, and it's excluded under your business and personal property exclusion. The difference here is your restoration period is 24 hours after the loss instead of 72. So it's a shorter restoration period. And then it ends 5 days after this damaged property has been replaced. So again, this isn't going to be covered in your cause of loss forms. You're not going to get regular business income and extra expense coverage. If it's caused by a mechanical breakdown, this is the only place you can get business income coverage. And when you think about something like a steam boiler explosion, it's not impossible that this could put you out of business for a time. So it's necessary coverage if you have a possible loss exposure here. It's perfectly acceptable to be thinking about covering your losses that way. Next insuring agreement, spoilage damage. So this will pay for any loss that you have that's from spoilage of perishable goods as a result of equipment breakdown. So a lot of times this is going to be lack of power, lack of heat, lack of refrigeration. Those are all really common. And then whatever you can do, if there is a way to temporarily restore power or heat or light or refrigeration, whatever it costs to do that. Maybe you got to bring in a bunch of generators. We'll do that if that's going to reduce the amount of loss under this coverage. So this is going to depend on your inputs and your outputs. Do you have perishable goods either on the input side or the output side that would be at risk if we had a loss of power or if we had loss of refrigeration or heat? For the same idea, we've got utility interruption. So this is going to extend the business and extra expense coverage to losses caused by the utility equipment breakdown. Remember, power outage off the premises is excluded as well. So this is another place where we're bringing back in some coverage that otherwise we don't have. In the declarations, it'll say, look, for this coverage to kick in, you have to have a power outage for more than a certain number of hours, and that will be listed in the declarations. We've seen these before newly acquired premises, ordinance, or law. Again, the thing that's different is that mechanical breakdowns are excluded. So we're just extending all these coverages that we've seen before to apply in the case of mechanical breakdown, and you can only have that if you have purchased mechanical breakdown or boiler machinery coverage. So automatically, yep, if you have newly acquired premises, these coverages extend over there. Sometimes after a building has been destroyed, we have to rebuild. Normally in the business and personal property policy, that's where we're handling that. But this cause of loss was mechanical breakdown. It's excluded. We're just rebuilding that coverage that we normally would have had back in. It's just that it was excluded before. Errors and omissions is kind of interesting. You'll have that. We didn't talk about this in the property policy the first time, but this is a line that's in there too. It can happen particularly with large businesses where we unintentionally forget to list something. We own a piece of property that's not listed on there. There's a location that we forgot to list. If you've got errors and omissions coverage, that will help make sure that we've got all our gaps covered, as long as it's an unintentional error. As long as we're not deliberately trying to reduce premium by deliberately excluding locations. If it's an accidental, unintentional error, this is where we can extend coverage. We have an additional line here too. This looks a little bit like dependent business income coverage. So remember, we said sometimes we have business income losses from other people's losses, right? Their property is damaged, and because they're down, we're dependent on them. Our supplier has been damaged, and now we're out of business. We got no inventory. Okay, same thing here, except that we're extending this to mechanical breakdown. Mechanical breakdown is excluded in the other policies that we talked about. So this is covering any business income loss I have or extra expense loss I have because of equipment breakdown at a location that is not mine, somebody else's. So maybe the place that we sell to has a mechanical breakdown that destroys their retail operation. We're their supplier. We've got no place for our finished goods to go. So we have to lay everybody off and hold off on production because we got no place to sell. There are other ways to manage this risk, but this is a very specific way to insure against that risk if it happens as a result of mechanical breakdown from, in that case, the person that we supply. And it can happen on either side of the supply chain. So that's contingent business income and extra expense. We have some exclusions here. Some of the exclusions are consistent with other exclusions that we've seen across the policy. Some of them are specific. One of the specific ones is testing equipment. So you can imagine we've got all these systems that are operating under pressure, and the way to test them is to overpressure them, to stress them. Well, that's a dangerous thing to do. When you stress something that's supposed to be operating under pressure, if you stress it too much, you're going to break it. So what we find out is normally losses resulting from testing equipment are going to be excluded here. And that's why, because the testing is specifically stressing it to its max. So we're increasing a situation, we're increasing hazard, we're creating situations where losses are sometimes caused. Testing during construction, normally that's going to be handled with the builder's risk policy. So at least that part you won't have to worry about. One other thing I want to mention, because the insurer has an incentive to inspect, right? So they're constantly looking at these systems. When they inspect, if they discover something unsafe or dangerous, they can say, effective right now, we are suspending coverage for this piece of equipment because we think it's at risk of a mechanical breakdown. Now, most of the time you're working with a cooperative business owner, they don't want that. They want their machines and equipment to operate appropriately. So if you discover that and you let them know, they're going to fix it right away. But if you get any pushback from them and the owner says, I don't know if I want to bother fixing it, then you would invoke this suspension condition and say, okay, well, we can't make you fix it, but from this day forward, we're suspending coverage on that equipment right now. So that's something that an insurance company can do. That's the suspension condition. And that's something that's unique in boiler and machinery coverage or equipment breakdown coverage. Okay, that's a decent place to call it quits for this piece here, especially considering I'm using new equipment. I'm going to go ahead and post this, and I could really use feedback on whether or not this was an improvement. Thanks a lot, you guys, for your attention and questions. I appreciate it. We'll go from there.